Okay, Module C, Learning Objective 2, we are going to talk about liability to clients. And specifically, we're going to talk about what would a client have to prove if they were to sue an auditor, and what are the defenses that are available to an auditor if a client sues them. So let's start with common law. And the most common source of lawsuits against CPAs are actually from their clients. So shareholder, those kind of class action lawsuits, those get all the headlines, but you're much more likely to be sued by one of your clients than you are from a third party. So, breach of contract. They can always sue you for breach of contract, which is just basically saying, hey, you didn't perform the services in accordance with the contract. And ultimately, that contract is your engagement letter. So if you remember back from undergraduate accounting, you're required to have an engagement letter which specifies what you're doing and when are you going to have the deliverable, which is, in the case of an audit, the audit report, how much you're going to get paid, all those kind of things. Now, the issue with breach of contract is that what the client needs to prove and what your defenses are possibly kind of depends on what's going on. So it's really very dependent on what the contract is and what you promise to do in the contract. So we're not going to spend very much time talking about breach of contract and as far as what a client has to prove. Um, and that is for a couple of reasons. We'll get into tort liability here in a second. But one, you're much more likely to be sued under tort liability than breach of contract. But the bigger reason is we can't really get too detailed in terms of uh, breach of contract because, like I said, the contracts that you can have would vary so much from client to client that it's not really worth going too much into. So, what do I want you guys to know? I just want you to know that one, you're most likely to be sued by one of your clients, and breach of contract is one way in which they can bring suit against you. And it's probably, in terms of, from their standpoint, going to be one of the more effective ways because they can point to a specific stipulation in the contract and say, hey, they didn't do this. That's a little bit easier to prove than as we're going to see in tort liability. Some of the more gray areas of what you would need to prove in terms of tort liability. Now, when people typically are going to sue you, they're probably going to be more likely to sue you under tort liability than breach of contract if they have the choice, right? So if it's a client and they're kind of choosing, okay, well, which one would I rather sue them? They're probably more likely to choose tort liability. And that is because if we think about it, we think back to our business law classes. Typically, under contracts, when you sue someone for a contract, the amount that you can recover under breach of contract is generally limited to something related to the contract, right? So some kind of value associated with the contract. And if we think about accounting services, that may not be very much, right? So if I really want to get into that auditor's pocket, I'm going to choose tort liability because the amounts that are recoverable are generally going to be larger under tort liability than they would be under breach of contract. So again, tort liability is the failure to exercise the appropriate level of care. And again, that's where these different levels are important. Are we talking about ordinary negligence, which is just lack of reasonable care? Are we talking about recklessness? Or are we talking about fraud? Now, what would a client have to prove if they sued you under common law tort liability? If they're suing you for negligence, there are four things that they need to prove. One, they need to prove duty. They need to prove that a duty of care existed, that you were required to exercise care in something uh, related to the services that you provided. That's not hard to prove, right? Because we do have a duty to exercise care in, in the services that we perform. So that's not very difficult to prove. The more difficult thing to prove is breach of duty, that we did not exercise reasonable care in performing our responsibilities. So again, that's probably a little bit more difficult to show. Injury. Injury is, obviously it's monetary. We're not talking about um, a physical injury. We're talking about, that they lost money somehow, or they're somehow harmed monetarily. Now, in terms of these three, like I said, duty is pretty easy to prove. Injury is also very easy to prove because, in general, people are not going to sue you unless they've been injured. Right? They're not just going to file a lawsuit willy nilly. There's got to be a reason why they're doing it. So 1 and 3 are pretty easy. 2 is where it gets a little bit more difficult in proving that you didn't exercise uh, due care. And then 4 is another burden that's difficult for people to prove, and that is proximate cause. And what proximate cause is that the injury that was suffered, so it's not just that the client lost money or that they suffered some kind of monetary damage, it's that the breach of duty on your behalf was the proximate cause of their injury. And so that also is difficult to prove. So it can't just be, oh, we lost money, so we're going to sue the auditor. They have to prove that what you did was the cause of their injury. And so, again, 2 and 4 are probably the more difficult things to prove in terms of negligence. In terms of constructive fraud, we're going to see a relationship between common law constructive fraud and common law fraud, and we're going to see this throughout. What you need to prove is essentially the same thing. What is going to be the difference? Well, it's that same difference we talked about when we were introducing the concepts. The difference between fraud and constructive fraud is intent. So that's going to be the only real difference between these two. So, what's the first thing you need to, that a client would need to prove if they're suing you for recklessness or constructive fraud? And the first thing is a material misrepresentation or omission. So it's not just that something was misstated. If you left something out that you know was material, that's also an issue. So either something is misrepresented or it's omitted. And because we're talking about constructive fraud, recklessness, we have to prove that it's something that's more than just negligence. It has to be something above and beyond just ordinary negligence. Reliance, that they actually relied on the information that you provided and that they suffered an injury. And so all of these things have to be present. If we look at common law fraud, again, it's going to be the exact same thing with the exception of 2. Instead of recklessness, it's going to be intent. So a material misrepresentation or omission. What do we call intent? We said that that's scienter, reliance, and injury. And so, what some people use is a mnemonic to remember what you need to prove under constructive fraud and fraud is that for fraud, we have to have Miss Re, like Mrs. Re, and for constructive fraud, it's Mr. Re. So you can conceptualize Miss Re as Rihanna, right? That's Miss Re. You can conceptualize constructive fraud as some guy related to Rihanna. So you say Chris Brown. There's been a lot, or maybe you don't want to use a Rihanna themed mnemonic. So maybe instead of mystery, you could say just mystery, right? Like the mystery machines, the Scooby Doo. And maybe instead of mystery, it's misery, like this course, or like the movie. So it doesn't matter how you get in your mind, just know that that's going to come up throughout this chapter. And so the sooner you understand what people have to prove if they're suing you for fraud and constructive fraud, the better off they're going to be. So it's always going to be mystery and mystery. So what are your defenses? What's available to you? Well, one is lack of duty. So you can say, well, there's no privity. So if someone's suing you because they're saying that you didn't do something, you could just say, hey, look, I didn't have a duty of care to you because I don't have a contract with you. So you had no expectation that I would have done that. Non-negligent performance is always an option. So you can say, I followed general accepted auditing standards. I did what a reasonable auditor would do. So I'm not liable for any losses that you suffered. Causation. This is a little bit more difficult to prove as far as a defense, but you can say, well, it wasn't what I did. It wasn't my negligence or my lack of care that caused your injury. Something else caused the loss to you. So it had nothing to do with what I did. You know, your bank wouldn't extend you credit. So you didn't have enough cash. And so you became insolvent and went out of business. It wasn't because of my lack of care. And then lastly, contributory negligence. So contributory negligence is the argument that the clients were at least partially responsible for the loss. So, for example, if a client was engaged in fraud and then they, they get sued and they go out of business and, they've lost all kinds of money. And then they sue you and say that, you are a party to the fraud because you audited these fraudulent financial statements. You can say, hey, look, wait a minute. I may be liable to people outside of the company because I didn't detect the fraud, but you're the one that committed the fraud. Okay, so you have no basis for suing me in this circumstance. So that's an option that's available for clients. And that's something that we'll talk about when we get to third party suing. That is specific to clients. So let's look at a couple of examples of things related to this. When CPAs fail in their duty to carry out contracts for services to liability clients, they may be liable based on which of the following ideas. And the answer is D. Breach of contract, yes, which we just talked about. If you don't fulfill the duties of your contract, your client can sue you for that. Strict liability, no. So, how do I know it's not strict liability? Well, one, we haven't talked about strict liability. So anytime you get asked a question about a concept that we've not discussed, it's probably not a good answer. In case you're wondering, what does strict liability mean? It means strictly liable without regard to intent, knowledge, or falsity. So there's certain items that people can be held strictly liable, and contracts is not one. Which of the following statements best describes whether CPA has met the required standard of care in conducting the audit of a client's financial statements? And so let's go through and look at this. The client's expectations in terms of accuracy. That doesn't sound good. Um, the standard of care is what another reasonable CPA would do, not what the client thinks the CPA should be doing. The accuracy of the financial statements. That's also not correct. If we think about the financial statements, the accuracy of the financial statements may have nothing to do at all with the auditor. So, for example, a client has a great internal control system and a great financial reporting process, and their financial statements are 100% accurate. Everything that should be where it is there, and it's perfectly reported. But an auditor just goes in and hands them an audit report without doing any work. Have they exercised due care in that situation? No. The financial statements are completely accurate, but they haven't exercised the right professional standard of care in terms of doing their work. So the accuracy of the financial statements, while they generally have a relationship with whether the auditor has done their job or not, it's not a perfect one for one. And the financial statements can be accurate without the auditor doing anything because the auditor is not the one that creates the financial statements. And then if we look at D, whether the audit was conducted to investigate and discover all acts of fraud. D's not good because, again, looking for one of those big words, all is the key word there. audits are not designed to detect all instances of fraud. They're designed to provide reasonable assurance that material acts of fraud are discovered. So the best answer is going to be C. Again, whether the auditor conducted the audit with the same skill and care that other CPAs would. A client suing a CPA for negligence must prove each of the following factors except which. And these all look like things that we just went over. And so we have to go back and say, okay, well, which one are they talking about? They're talking about negligence. And we said for ordinary negligence, they need to prove duty, breach of duty, proximate cause, and injury. The one that we see that's listed there that was not in that list is reliance. So some people are like, well, wait a minute, isn't proximate cause the same as reliance? And they are not the same. Proximate cause is saying that the proximate cause of the injury was the negligence, and that's different. For the next one, which of the following elements, if present, would support a finding of constructive fraud? So we're looking for for recklessness. And again, this is where knowing the definitions helps. Constructive fraud, we said we're going to use synonymously with gross negligence, so the answer is going to be B. Those are the same thing. Fill in the blank. Blank may not always be a viable defense in a suit against a CPA by the client. Accordingly, a CPA should use a blank to significantly reduce related adverse legal actions by clients. So we're thinking about items that may not be a good defense when a client is suing you. One of the worst defenses you can use when a client is suing you is privity. Because obviously, if they're a client, they have a contractual relationship with you somehow, whether it's express or implied. They have some kind of contract with you. Accordingly, you should use an engagement letter to help reduce related adverse legal actions by clients. So that is it for learning objective 2.